A forgotten soldier's honor lay buried under a barn, hidden away for 40 years, while another man wore the title of hero. Carl Turner, celebrated by his community, had in truth built his reputation on betrayal and silence. But when John Miller and his loyal dog uncovered Daniel Harris's medals, photographs, and flag, the truth finally surfaced. Just listen to how this long-buried injustice was brought into the light, and why at last true honor prevailed. John Miller had lived a life that few truly understood. In his early 60s now, he carried himself with quiet strength, the kind of presence that came not from boasting, but from surviving things that left their mark. His modest farmhouse in the outskirts of Missouri was his sanctuary. It sat on a patch of land bordered by open fields and thick woods, the sort of place where the sounds of traffic faded and were replaced by birdsong, the rustle of wind through trees, and the creak of his weathered barn when storms rolled in. The barn itself had stood for generations before John bought the property. Its planks were gray and sun-beaten, with nails rusting at the edges, but it had character. John never minded the creaks or the smell of old hay that seemed to cling to the wood, no matter how many times he cleaned it out. He liked it that way. It reminded him that even things worn down by time could still stand. John's closest companion was Duke, a broad-shouldered German shepherd with a coat of deep sable and eyes that followed him everywhere. Duke had been more than a pet since the day John adopted him. He was family. When nights grew restless and memories from John's service crept back into his mind, it was Duke's steady breathing at his side that kept him anchored. In Duke's loyalty, John had found a kind of peace he hadn't thought possible. Life on the farm was simple, and that was how John wanted it. After decades of structure, deployments, and losses that he didn't talk about much, this quiet corner of Missouri gave him the kind of stability he longed for. He spent his mornings tending to small chores, afternoons mending fences or working in the garden, and evenings sitting on the porch with Duke lying at his boots. But some mornings carried surprises. It was a warm day in early summer when John noticed Duke acting differently. The sun had only just cleared the horizon, spilling gold light across the fields, and John was sipping his first cup of coffee when Duke darted off toward the barn. At first, John thought little of it. Duke often chased after rabbits or squirrels, nose to the ground and tail wagging. But this time there was no playful bark, no moment of stillness before bounding after something that moved in the grass. Instead, Duke pawed at the dirt along the barn's side wall with frantic energy, throwing clumps of earth behind him. John called out once, but Duke didn't stop. The dog's paws dug faster, his body straining forward, and every so often he let out a sharp whine before turning his head to look at John. It wasn't the kind of bark that meant, "I've found a rabbit." It was something else entirely, urgent, almost pleading. Curiosity stirred in John's chest. Years of service had sharpened his instincts, and he'd learned to trust them. Animals, he knew, had senses humans didn't. When a dog acted like this, it wasn't for nothing. Setting down his mug, John walked toward the barn, boots crunching against gravel, and then sinking into softer earth as he approached. "All right, Duke," he muttered softly, more to himself than the dog. "What's got you worked up?" The closer he came, the more he could see the determination in Duke's movements. His front paws tore into the ground, mud staining the fur around his nails, and each time John tried to call him off, Duke ignored him completely. John crouched low, pressing a hand to the soil where Duke had been working. It was looser there, disturbed in a way that seemed deliberate, not by the dog, but by something older, something buried. A flicker of unease passed through him, but he shook it off. Reaching for the shovel he kept leaning against the side of the barn, John pushed the blade into the earth. The soil was damp and heavy, but he worked steadily, with Duke circling him, panting, nudging his arm as if urging him on. Shovel after shovel, the hole deepened. John's muscles ached, but the more he dug, the stronger that instinct grew. He wasn't just clearing dirt, he was uncovering something that had been hidden for years. Then the shovel struck something solid. The sound was different from rock or root, a sharp thunk, wood against steel. John froze for a moment, heart thudding in his chest. He knelt, brushing aside the soil with his hands, until the edge of what looked like an old plank emerged. It wasn't part of the barn's foundation. It was separate, lodged deep beneath the earth. Duke let out another low whine, ears pulled back but eyes locked on the spot. John leaned back on his heels, staring at the buried wood. Questions crowded his mind. Who put it there? How long had it been hidden? And why, of all places, under this barn? As he reached for the plank with his calloused hands, one thing became clear. Whatever Duke had uncovered, it wasn't just another forgotten scrap of farm life. This was something different, something meant to stay buried. John brushed away the last layer of soil until his fingers felt the edges of a box. It was small, about the size of an old footlocker, but so rotted from years underground that the wood flaked away under his grip. Duke paced in a slow circle around him, ears alert, tail low, his instincts mirroring the unease building in John's chest. Grunting, John worked the box loose, tugging until it finally gave way with a groan of damp wood. He pulled it onto the grass, brushing away clumps of dirt. For a moment he thought it might be nothing more than discarded farm equipment, something a previous owner had buried and forgotten. But the weight of it felt different, heavy, intentional. John knelt, steadying the lid with one hand and prying with the other until the rusted nails gave way. The hinges broke with a brittle snap. He lifted the lid. The smell of age and earth spilled out. Inside, carefully folded but warped by moisture, lay objects that froze John where he knelt. Military medals glinted faintly in the morning light, their ribbons frayed yet unmistakable. Next to them were photographs, sepia-tinged, water-stained, but still clear enough to recognize faces. And folded with solemn precision was an American flag, its fabric dulled by years underground. John's heart hammered as he reached in and lifted one of the photographs with shaking fingers. The image showed a young man in uniform, smiling proudly, the name stenciled faintly at the bottom, Private Daniel Harris. The name landed in John's memory like a stone thrown into still water, rippling outward. Harris. He remembered hearing it whispered among veterans groups, the name listed on reports of men who never came back from overseas. A soldier marked as missing decades ago. John's throat tightened. These weren't just keepsakes. They were remnants of a life cut short, hidden away instead of honored. He lifted another photograph, a wedding portrait. Daniel stood in dress uniform beside a young woman in a simple gown, a baby cradled in her arms. The smiles were wide, filled with hope for a future that never came. John's stomach lurched. These weren't mementos to be cherished. They had been buried as if meant to be forgotten. And then he saw it. At the bottom of the crate, wrapped in stained cloth, was something metallic. John hesitated before unrolling the bundle, his instincts urging caution. Inside lay a revolver, its barrel rusted, its grip worn with use. Across the steel, faint brown streaks marked its surface, dulled by time but still recognizable to someone who had seen too much in his life. John sat back on his heels, the revolver heavy in his hands, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't a farming tool. This wasn't equipment left behind. This was evidence of something darker, something hidden deliberately. The photographs trembled in his grip as he laid them across his lap. A young soldier in his prime, a family that had once waited for him to return, medals that should have been displayed proudly in a case or pinned to a uniform at a memorial service. Instead, they had been shoved into a rotting box and buried under dirt like unwanted clutter. Why? The question echoed in his mind, louder than the morning breeze and Duke's quiet panting. Why would someone bury a soldier's life like this? Who had wanted these memories erased? John's eyes swept across the barn, its weathered boards standing silent, as though holding on to secrets of its own. The land around him suddenly felt different, heavier. He thought of Daniel's widow, if she was still alive, of the child in the photograph, perhaps grown now, living somewhere never knowing the truth. He clenched the medal in his hand until the edges pressed into his palm. This wasn't just a box. It was a story interrupted, a legacy stolen. And beneath it all lingered the one truth John couldn't shake. Someone had buried this on purpose. Someone had wanted Daniel Harris's name, his service, his memory erased. John looked at the revolver again, unease gnawing at him. The stain across its surface wasn't from time alone. His instincts told him it carried a history, and not the kind written in service records. The barn stood still, the fields stretched quiet. But inside John, something had shifted. Whatever this was, it was bigger than a forgotten crate. It was a mystery waiting to be uncovered. And deep down, John knew this was only the beginning. John carried the crate inside with deliberate care, setting it on the worn oak table that had served as his command post for years of retirement. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, the glow of a single desk lamp cast long shadows over the room as he sifted through every item, piecing together fragments of a life long erased. The photographs lay spread out like a family album stolen from time. The medals, though tarnished, gleamed with the honor of service. And the revolver, heavy and silent, sat on the table as though demanding answers. John couldn't let it go. He needed to know who had buried these memories in the dirt. Hours slipped by as he combed through old records, digging deep into archives only a man with his discipline and persistence could endure. He called the few friends still alive from his division, men with voices now frail, but memories sharp as ever. Each call added another piece to the puzzle until a name surfaced, one that set John's jaw tight. Carl Turner. Turner had served in the same division as Private Daniel Harris. Unlike Harris, Turner had made it home. He'd been greeted with handshakes, medals pinned to his chest, and the title of hero. In this small Missouri town, Turner's name was spoken with reverence. The local VFW hall still carried a plaque in his honor. But behind the gloss of public recognition, John uncovered something darker. Buried in yellowed reports and whispered recollections were hints of misconduct, supplies gone missing, patrol routes altered without explanation, and the most haunting detail of all, an ambush. One firefight gone wrong, where Private Harris had disappeared. Witness accounts conflicted, but the threads all pointed back to Turner, whispers of betrayal that had never reached daylight. John leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. He stared at the medals again, realizing the cruel truth. These weren't Turner's honors. They belonged to Harris, the man who had vanished, the man whose memory had been buried along with his belongings. Turner hadn't safeguarded them. He had hidden them. And the revolver? Wrapped in cloth, stained with the passage of time, yet bearing a mark John couldn't mistake. It felt less like a weapon and more like a confession. Proof of something that Turner couldn't afford to let anyone see. The anger came slowly at first, a simmer in John's chest. Then it roared to life, raw and unrelenting, his fists clenched on the table, knuckles whitening as memories surged. He saw faces, friends who had fallen, brothers he'd buried, men who had stood tall and given everything, never asking for more than honor and truth. Men like Daniel Harris, and then there were men like Carl Turner. Turner had walked back into town draped in medals, hailed as a man of valor. He had lived his life respected, celebrated, even admired. He had stood on parade floats during Memorial Day, shaking hands, wearing the mask of honor. All the while, the truth lay hidden beneath the floorboards of his old barn, rotting away like a wound no one wanted to see. John's chest tightened. It wasn't just betrayal, it was theft. Turner had stolen Harris's legacy, buried it, and claimed the spotlight for himself. The injustice of it churned inside John like fire catching wind. His breathing grew unsteady, the edges of the photographs blurred as his eyes filled, not just from fury, but from the weight of memory. His scars throbbed, not the ones on his skin, but the ones carved deeper, the ones that never healed. He had promised himself peace when he left the service, but peace was impossible when men like Harris were forgotten and men like Turner were honored. John's PTSD rose unbidden, flashes of battlefield chaos overwhelming his senses. Gunfire in the distance that wasn't there. The shouts of men long gone. The choking dust of jungles half a world away. He pressed his palms hard against the table, grounding himself, forcing his mind back into the silence of his farmhouse. But the anger remained, smoldering and alive. This wasn't just a mystery hidden under dirt. It was an injustice that had festered for 40 years. Every passing year had deepened the stain. And now John knew. He couldn't unsee it. The photographs, the medals, the flag, they weren't just relics. They were a call to action. Harris's voice, silenced decades ago, now spoke through them. John's fists unclenched slowly, but his resolve hardened. If Turner had lived as a hero built on lies, then it was time the truth saw daylight. And John Miller, who had spent a lifetime carrying the weight of fallen brothers, would not let this injustice rest. Not now, not ever. John didn't stop once the truth had surfaced. The box, its contents, and every detail he had uncovered pressed on him like a responsibility too heavy to set aside. He knew that if he turned his back now, Harris would remain another name lost in shadows, while Turner's false legacy stood tall. That wasn't acceptable. Not for John, not for any man who had worn the uniform with honor. He began with the family. With careful steps, John tracked down the last known address of Daniel Harris's widow. She was still alive, though now elderly, living quietly in Kansas. John wrote her a letter first, a letter he drafted and redrafted until the words felt right. No details of scandal or accusation, just truth, compassion, and the news that he had found something of her husband's. When she agreed to meet, John drove across state lines with the crate buckled into the passenger seat as though it were precious cargo. Duke lay in the back, his steady presence keeping John calm. The reunion was nothing John could have prepared for. The widow's hands trembled as he placed the medals and folded flag into her lap. Decades of composure broke the moment her fingers brushed the ribbon edges. Tears filled her eyes, not of anger, but of long-suppressed grief finally given release. For the first time since her husband vanished, she had a piece of him back, a truth restored, a memory made whole. Beside her stood a man in his 40s, tall, with his father's same sharp eyes. He was the baby from the photograph, the son who had grown up with only questions, only silence. Now, through John, he finally learned the truth of what had happened to his father. His voice cracked when he thanked John, gripping his hand with the strength of someone carrying both sorrow and gratitude at once. That moment alone could have been enough, but John knew it couldn't end there. Turner's name still rang in the community as untouchable, praised on plaques, and remembered in speeches. The lie had outlived him, standing like a monument built on sand. John refused to let it remain. He gathered the evidence, the revolver, the photographs, the records he'd uncovered, and handed them over to the authorities. But he didn't stop at officials. A local journalist, known for her relentless pursuit of the truth, took the story to the public. Within weeks, the tale spread like wildfire through the community. Carl Turner, the man once celebrated as a hero, was revealed for what he was, a soldier who had buried another man's honor under his own lies. The town's perception shifted almost overnight. Plaques were reconsidered, stories retold, and the truth about Daniel Harris found the place it deserved in history. For John, though, this wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about tearing someone down. It was about lifting someone up, someone who had given his life and never been properly remembered. The day Harris's family stood by his grave, medals gleaming proudly at last, John joined them in silence. The widow's frail hand clutched the folded flag against her heart. The son laid a photograph at the headstone, the same wedding portrait that had once sat in darkness under the barn. Now it shone in the sunlight where it belonged. John stood a few paces back, Duke sitting loyally at his side. For the first time in years, he felt a weight ease from his shoulders, a knot inside him loosen. The faces of his brothers still lingered in his memory, but now there was peace in knowing that one of them, Daniel Harris, had finally been given the dignity he was owed. It wasn't about undoing the past. Nothing could do that. But it was about setting something right, even decades late, about making sure that the truth had the last word, not the lie. As John watched the family bow their heads in quiet prayer, the air seemed lighter, the silence no longer heavy but reverent. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it fights its way back into the light, demanding to be seen. And sometimes, John thought with a faint smile as he glanced at Duke, it takes the loyalty of a dog to uncover the truth that changes everything. And for John Miller, that truth had finally brought relief.